The knocking started at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in November, insistent and arrhythmic like someone who'd forgotten how normal people knocked. I'd been asleep for maybe 40 minutes, that shallow sleep where you're still half listening to the building settle. The knocking pulled me up through layers of exhaustion, and I knew before I reached the door that whoever stood on the other side was drowning. I wrapped my robe tighter and checked the peephole. A man in his late 30s stood under the hallway's flickering light, wearing a suit that probably cost more than my monthly rent. His face was the kind of handsome that came with personal trainers and dermatologists, but his eyes were hollow caves. I recognized him vaguely from the community center, one of those people who attended events irregularly, always checking his phone, never quite settling into conversations. I opened the door without the chain. Some instinct told me he wasn't dangerous, just desperate. He stared at me for 3 full seconds before speaking. His mouth opened, closed, opened again. "I'm sorry," he finally said, his voice rough like he'd been shouting or crying or both. "I'm so sorry about the hour. Your name kept coming up, people said you. I didn't know where else." His hands were shaking. One of them gripped his phone so tightly, I could see the whites of his knuckles. The other kept adjusting his tie, loosening it, tightening it, a nervous tick that probably drove his colleagues crazy. I stepped back and gestured him inside without saying anything. Sometimes words were obstacles. I'd learned that from 30 years of late-night visitors, people who arrived at my door carrying weights they couldn't name. He hesitated in the doorway, and I caught the smell of airport. That specific combination of recycled air and stress sweat, layered over expensive cologne that couldn't quite mask it. My apartment welcomed him with the same patient silence it had welcomed hundreds of others. I moved to the kitchen alcove and filled my old kettle, the one with the dent from when my daughter dropped it in 1987. The water ran cold, then warm, then hot enough. I set it on the stove and turned the flame to medium. The man stood in my living room like he'd forgotten how to be in a space that wasn't optimized for productivity. "Sit," I said, gesturing to the worn couch. He looked at it like it might swallow him. His phone buzzed in his pocket, a persistent vibration I could hear from 6 feet away. He ignored it. The phone buzzed again. He pulled it out, glanced at the screen, 17 notifications lighting up his face in the dim room, and shoved it back in his pocket. I turned on the lamp beside my armchair, the reading lamp with the amber shade that made the room feel like a confession booth. The light caught the photographs on my walls. Decades of community members at weddings and graduations and ordinary Tuesdays. He stared at them like he was trying to find himself in the frames. He wouldn't. He'd never stayed long enough to be photographed. The kettle began its low whistle. I moved slowly, deliberately, pulling down 2 cups, measuring tea leaves into the ceramic pot my mother brought from the old country. Chamomile and lavender, the blend for people who needed to remember how to breathe. He was still standing, shifting his weight from foot to foot, checking his watch every 30 seconds like time might save him if he monitored it closely enough. "You can sit," I said again. "It's not a suggestion." That got through. He lowered himself to the edge of the couch, perched like a bird ready to flee. His suit jacket bunched awkwardly and he didn't fix it. That told me something. A man who wore suits like armor, but couldn't be bothered to adjust one, was a man who'd stopped caring about the performance. I poured the tea and brought both cups to the coffee table, setting his within reach. He didn't touch it. I settled into my armchair, the one positioned at an angle so I could see without staring, listen without looming. The sandalwood incense I'd burned earlier still hung faintly in the air, mixing with the lavender sachets tucked into my bookshelves. His cologne was losing the fight against my apartment's accumulated scents. 50 years of herbs and old paper and careful listening. "I need to tell someone," he said suddenly. The words came out like he'd been holding them behind his teeth and they'd finally broken through. Then he stopped. His jaw worked. His phone buzzed again, angry and insistent. I waited. The silence between us had weight, the kind that either crushed you or held you up depending on whether you fought it. "Do you need to take that?" I asked. Not a question, really. An observation. He looked at his phone like it had betrayed him, then held the power button until the screen went black. The silence in the room deepened. Without the phone's periodic buzzing, there was just the old building settling, the radiator's occasional clank, the sound of two people breathing in a space designed for truth. He wrapped his hands around the teacup but didn't lift it. The steam rose between us, carrying lavender and chamomile and the faint bitterness of leaves steeped too long. I watched his hands shake against the ceramic, designer watch on his left wrist, the kind that costs more than my car. No wedding ring. Manicured nails but cuticles picked raw. A man who maintained surfaces but destroyed himself in small, hidden ways. "My mother died 3 weeks ago," he said. The words came out flat, practiced, like he'd said them before to other people who'd offered condolences he didn't want. I was in Singapore. There was a deal, 8 months of negotiations. Everything was riding on me being there to close it. He looked up at me, and I saw him waiting for me to nod, to make sympathetic noises, to offer him the easy comfort that would let him off the hook. I didn't nod. I took a sip of my tea and waited. His face did something complicated. Collapsed a little, then hardened. "She'd been sick for a while," he continued. "My sister Elena called me when Mom went into the hospital. Said it was getting bad, I should come home. But the Singapore trip was already scheduled, the investors were already committed if I didn't show." He trailed off. His hands tightened on the cup. "I promised I'd be back in 3 days. That was the plan. Fly to Singapore, close the deal, fly home. 3 days. The clock on my mantel ticked. It was an old clock, the kind that counted seconds loudly enough to remind you they were passing. He flinched at each tick like it was an accusation. "I was in the middle of my presentation when my phone started blowing up," he said. 17 missed calls in 20 minutes. I stepped out of the conference room and called Elena back. She was crying so hard I could barely understand her. "Mom had maybe hours," she said. "Maybe less. Get on a plane now." He stopped. His breathing had gone shallow. I could see his chest rising and falling too quickly. The beginning of panic he was trying to control. "I made a choice," he said. The words were so quiet I almost didn't hear them. "I told Elena I'd catch the next flight. But first I had to finish the presentation. 30 more minutes, that's all it would take. The investors were right there, we were so close, if I walked out we'd lose everything. 30 minutes. His laugh was a broken sound. I went back in and closed the deal. The tea was cooling between us. Outside, a car alarm started wailing, then stopped. The building's radiator clanked 3 times. He didn't seem to hear any of it. He was somewhere else, in a conference room in Singapore, making a choice that would define the rest of his life. "She died while I was in the cab to the airport," he said. I had my phone in my hand, refreshing my email, checking the contract the lawyers had just sent. 17 missed calls from Elena, 12 from my brother David, 6 from numbers I didn't recognize. I saw them all light up the screen, and I thought, just let me get to the airport first, let me get through security, then I'll call back. His voice cracked. "She died, and I was reading an email about stock options." I took another sip of tea. The chamomile was bitter now, oversteeped, but I didn't flinch. He needed to see that I could hold this, that his words wouldn't break me or make me turn away. That was the thing people needed most. Someone who wouldn't shatter under the weight of their truth. David's voicemail said, "Don't bother coming now," he continued. Said I'd made my choice, There was nothing left for me to do. But I went anyway. I got on the plane, flew 14 hours, went straight to the funeral home. He looked at his hands like they belonged to someone else. I tried to see her, but Elena blocked me. Said I'd given up that right. Said Mom kept asking for me at the end. Kept saying, "Where's Marcus? Where's my boy?" And they had to lie to her. Had to tell her I was coming, that I'd be there soon. What was the deal worth? I asked. My first real question. He blinked at me like he'd forgotten I was there. 12 million, he said. For the company. My share was 3.5. I nodded slowly. And what was your mother worth? He opened his mouth. Closed it. The question sat between us like a living thing. He had no answer, and we both knew it. Numbers were easy. He could quantify revenue and market share and profit margins. But his mother, the woman who'd carried him and raised him and died asking where he was, she existed in a space beyond his ability to measure. The funeral was 4 days ago, he said eventually, his voice hollow. I stood in the back. Elena wouldn't let me sit with the family. My own mother's funeral, and I stood in the back like a stranger. They asked David to give the eulogy. He talked about how Mom never missed a single one of his kids' soccer games, how she showed up for every birthday and holiday, how she was always there when you needed her. He looked right at me when he said always. Everyone turned to stare. Did you try to speak? I asked. He shook his head. Elena told me before the service that I'd given up that right. Said if I tried to get up there and perform grief, she'd walk out. So I stood in the back and I listened to David and Elena talk about a woman who sounded like a stranger. All these stories about family dinners and inside jokes and traditions. And I kept thinking, was I even there for those? Did I miss them or did I just not pay attention? The pre-dawn gray was starting to show at the edges of my curtains. We'd been sitting here for over an hour, and he'd barely moved except to shake. His tea sat untouched, a skin forming on the surface. I could see the exhaustion in his face now, the kind that went deeper than one sleepless night. Tell me about your relationship with your mother, I said. Before the end. Before the hospital. He looked at me like I'd asked him to explain quantum physics. His face went through several expressions, settling on something like confusion. We talked, he said slowly. I called her every Sunday, visited on major holidays. She'd ask about work. I'd tell her it was fine. She'd talk about Elena's kids, David's promotion, neighborhood gossip I didn't care about. We'd run out of things to say after 20 minutes, but I'd stay on the phone for 40 because that seemed like enough time. His hands were still now, wrapped around the cold cup. I always felt like I was performing, you know? Like there was a script for how sons talk to their mothers, and I was following it, but I didn't understand why the words were supposed to matter. When did you start feeling that way? I asked. The performance feeling. He was quiet for so long I thought he might not answer. Then something in his face shifted, defenses crumbling under the weight of exhaustion and 3 weeks of guilt. Always, he said finally. For as long as I can remember, I felt like I was playing a part in a family that everyone else understood naturally. Like they all got a handbook I never received. Tell me a specific memory, I said. The earliest one where you felt like you didn't fit. He closed his eyes. Family dinners, he said. Every Sunday, the whole extended family. Aunts and uncles and cousins. Everyone talking and laughing and interrupting each other. There were inside jokes I never understood. Stories they'd told 1,000 times that everyone else thought were hilarious. I'd sit there and try to laugh at the right moments, but I was always half a beat off. Mom would look at me sometimes with this expression I couldn't read. Disappointment, maybe. Or confusion. Like she couldn't figure out why her son was a stranger at her own table. How old were you? I asked. 7, 8, all through childhood. He opened his eyes. There was this family reunion when I was 12. Big camping trip, everyone going. I'd just made the debate team, had my first tournament the same weekend. I asked if I could skip the reunion. You should have seen Mom's face. Like I'd asked to skip Christmas. She said family comes first, always. But I went to the debate tournament anyway. Won second place. Came home expecting, I don't know, pride maybe. She didn't speak to me for 3 days. And your siblings? I asked. Elena and David. Were they different? His laugh was bitter. They were perfect. Elena was the one who organized everything, remembered everyone's birthdays, called relatives just to chat. David was the golden boy, star athlete, everyone's favorite. They had this connection, the two of them. They'd share looks across the table, communicate without words. I was always on the outside of that. The gray at the window was turning lighter. Dawn was coming whether we were ready or not. He looked at the window like he'd just realized the night was ending. That soon he'd have to leave this space and face the world again. I built my company partly to prove I belonged somewhere, he said suddenly. The words tumbled out faster now, like a dam breaking. Created this whole empire where people valued me for quantifiable reasons. Revenue growth, market share, things I could measure and control. My employees respect me because I make them money. My investors trust me because I deliver returns. It's transactional, but at least I understand the rules. I leaned forward slightly. And relationships that aren't transactional terrify me, he finished. His voice was barely a whisper. What if I'm just built wrong? What if everyone else has this capacity for connection that I'm missing? What if Mom died believing I never loved her because I don't actually know how? There it was. The fear beneath the guilt. Not that he'd made a bad choice, but that the choice revealed something fundamentally broken in his construction. I'd seen this before. People who believed their worst moments proved their essential nature. Do you want to know what I see? I asked. He nodded, desperate. I see a man who's been running from a question he's never been able to answer. Not why did I choose the deal over my mother, but why have I always felt like I don't belong anywhere? The room was fully light now. I could hear my neighbors starting to move around. Water running through old pipes, footsteps on the floor above. The building was waking up, and we'd been here all night excavating the architecture of his pain. I should make coffee, I said, standing. Neither of us will eat, but I should make the offer. He didn't argue. I moved to the kitchen and went through the motions, grinding beans, filling the pot, setting out bread I wouldn't toast. He followed me with his eyes, tracking my movements like they were a lifeline. What do I do? He asked. How do I make this right? I turned to face him, leaning against the counter. What would right look like to you? He opened his mouth, closed it. The same pattern as when he'd first arrived. I want the guilt to stop, he said finally. I want to wake up without feeling like I'm drowning. I want my family to forgive me. I want to believe I'm not a monster. Those are things you want to feel, I said. I asked what making it right would look like. What actions, not what absolution. He had no answer. I poured coffee into 2 mugs and brought them to the table. The smell was sharp and dark, cutting through the lingering lavender and sandalwood. He wrapped his hands around the mug the same way he'd held the tea, seeking warmth he couldn't quite absorb. Tell me about Elena and David now, I said. After the funeral. He flinched. Elena won't return my calls. I've tried 17 times. It goes straight to voicemail. David sent 1 text. Said I got what I wanted. Hope the money was worth it. Lose his number. They've shut me out completely. I watched his hands on the mug. They were steady now, But his body language told a different story. Shoulders curved inward, head down, the posture of someone trying to make himself smaller. Do you blame them? I asked. No, he said immediately. They're right. I deserve it. Mom died alone because of me, and they were there. They held her hand. They heard her last words. They earned their grief. I just showed up late and expected to be welcomed. You're doing it again, I observed. He looked up, confused. Turning it into a transaction. You didn't earn grief, so you don't deserve access to it. They performed family, you didn't, so they get to keep it and you don't. His face went through several expressions. Anger first, then confusion, then something like recognition. I don't know how else to think about it, he admitted. I know, I said. That's the problem. I took a sip of coffee and watched him over the rim. You've been treating relationships like business deals your whole life. Effort in, connection out. But you never felt like you were getting the return you were promised, so you stopped investing. Focused on actual business deals instead, where the math made sense. The morning light was harsh now, showing every line of exhaustion on his face. His expensive suit was wrinkled, the tie loosened, the carefully constructed armor of his professional life falling apart. He looked more human than he probably had in years, and it was clearly killing him. What if my siblings are right, he said quietly. What if I am incapable of love? What if Mom died believing that, and it was true? I set down my coffee. That's the question that's really driving you here, isn't it? Not whether you made a bad choice, but whether the choice proved you're fundamentally unlovable. Yes, he whispered. The word came out broken. Because if that's just who I am, then what's the point of any of this? What's the point of guilt or redemption or trying to fix things? You can't fix something that was never whole to begin with. I studied him for a long moment. There was something in the way he described his family, the persistent outsider feeling, the sense of never quite belonging despite being raised by these people. It wasn't just psychology. It felt like more, like there was a concrete reason for the disconnection he couldn't name. But I didn't have enough information yet. Just an intuition, a pattern I'd seen before in other people's stories. I'll help you, I said finally. His head snapped up, hope and terror warring on his face. But I'm not going to offer you comfort or easy answers. I'm not going to tell you you're forgiven, or that you're a good person who made one bad choice. I'm going to witness your choices, and you're going to sit with the discomfort of not knowing if you're redeemable. Okay, he said. His voice was small. What do I do first? The first step isn't about your mother anymore, I said. It's about Elena and David. You need to try to reconcile with them. Face what you destroyed beyond your mother's deathbed. He was already shaking his head before I finished. They hate me. They're right to hate me. It's impossible. They'll never, he stopped. Took a breath. They'll just confirm what I already know about myself. Exactly, I said. You're terrified they'll prove you're unlovable. But until you face them, you're using your dead mother as a shield. The guilt about her keeps you from addressing the pattern with everyone else. You can't move forward until you face the living. What if they refuse to see me, he asked. What if reconciliation fails? What if I try and it just makes everything worse? Then you'll know you tried, I said. But I suspect your siblings carry answers you need. The way you describe your relationship with them, the way you've always felt like an outsider in your own family, there's something there you're not seeing. He looked at me for a long moment, searching my face for something I couldn't give him. Then he nodded, a tiny movement full of terror. Okay, he said. I'll try. I'll call Elena today. Maybe David. Try to, I don't know, explain. Apologize. Something. Not on the phone, I said. In person. Look them in the eye. Let them see you broken. That's the only way this has a chance of being real. He stood slowly, like his bones hurt. The movement reminded me how long we'd been sitting here, how the night had passed in this bubble of confession. He looked around my apartment like he was seeing it for the first time, taking in the photographs and books and decades of accumulated life. "Thank you," he said, "for listening. For not," he gestured vaguely, "for not making it easy." I walked him to the door. The hallway outside was bright with morning, harsh fluorescent light that made us both squint. He checked his watch, a reflexive gesture, then seemed to realize it didn't matter what time it was. His phone was still off in his pocket. I wondered how long that would last. He paused at the threshold. "What if I can't do this?" he asked. "What if I try to reconcile and I just make everything worse? What if I'm too broken to fix?" "Then you'll know," I said. "But you won't know until you try. And right now, not knowing is killing you slower than failing ever could." He nodded and stepped into the hallway. I watched him walk toward the stairs, his expensive shoes silent on the worn carpet. At the top of the stairs, he pulled out his phone and powered it on. The screen lit up immediately, notifications flooding in, 17, 20, 30. The world rushing back to claim him. He looked at it for a moment, then back at me. "Thank you," he said again. Then he was gone, footsteps echoing down the stairwell, each step taking him back toward a life that would try to convince him this night never happened. I closed the door and turned back to my apartment. The 2 cups sat on the coffee table, one empty, one untouched. The chair where he'd perched still held the impression of his weight. The morning light was filling the room now, erasing the intimate darkness we'd shared. I picked up the cold tea and carried it to the kitchen. As I poured it down the sink, I found myself speaking aloud, a habit from years of living alone. "There's something he doesn't know," I said to the empty room. "Something about why he's always felt like he doesn't belong. The way he described his family, it's not just psychology. There's a truth there, something concrete." The tea swirled down the drain, lavender and chamomile and 3 weeks of grief. I rinsed the cup and set it in the dish rack. Outside my window, the city was fully awake now, people heading to work, living their lives, unaware that in my 3rd-floor apartment, a man had just spent the night confronting the possibility that he was incapable of love. I thought about Elena and David, the siblings who'd shut him out. I thought about his mother, dying while asking for a son who chose a business deal instead. I thought about the pattern he'd described, a lifetime of feeling like an outsider in his own family, and something in my chest tightened with recognition. I'd seen this before. Not exactly this, but the shape of it. The adoptee who didn't know. The family secret that explained everything. But I couldn't be sure yet. I needed more information, needed to understand the family dynamics better. Needed him to talk to Elena and David, to push against their rejection and see what emerged. He would fail probably. They would refuse to see him or slam the door in his face. And that failure would break him further, crack him open wider. But sometimes breaking was the only way to see what was underneath. Sometimes you had to shatter the surface before you could reach the truth. I moved back to the living room and settled into my armchair. The morning stretched ahead of me, empty and full of possibility. In a few hours, he would try to contact his siblings. In a few hours, he would face their anger and rejection. And somewhere in that confrontation, if I was right, the real story would begin to emerge. The story of why he'd never belonged. The story his mother had taken to her grave. The story that would either destroy him or remake him into someone who could finally answer the question that had haunted him his entire life. Who am I, and why does it feel like I don't fit anywhere? I closed my eyes and let the morning sun warm my face. The night of confession was over. But the real work was just beginning. 3 days after leaving Benya's apartment with a mandate to contact my siblings, I returned with a leather notebook, the kind executives carry into acquisition meetings. Moleskine, expensive, full of carefully prepared talking points I'd drafted at 2 in the morning when sleep wouldn't come. I sat in the same worn armchair where I'd first confessed my failure. This time I felt different. Prepared. I had a strategy. Benya looked at the notebook the way oncologists look at suspicious moles. I opened to the first page, showed her my outline. 3 key messages for Elena, 5 for David. Acknowledgement of absence, expression of regret, commitment to future presence. I'd even color-coded the emotional beats. Green for connection, yellow for vulnerability, red for critical admissions. She asked me to close the notebook. I told her I just wanted to be prepared, didn't want to say the wrong thing, needed to get this right. My pen was already in my hand. I'd bought it specifically for this, a Mont Blanc that felt substantial enough to mark important decisions. Benya asked me to tell her one genuine memory of Elena, something that had nothing to do with my success or failure. Just her. Just us. I opened my mouth and nothing came. The silence stretched. Benya's old clock ticked on the mantel. I could hear traffic outside, someone's television through the wall, the sound of my own breathing getting shallow. I finally said I remembered Elena being disappointed in me. That was the memory that came. Not a specific moment of joy or connection. Just her face at various ages, wearing variations of the same expression. Resignation mixed with hurt. Benya nodded slowly, like I'd confirmed something she suspected. She told me about Elena as she understood her from my previous descriptions. The middle child who mediated between the ambitious oldest and the sensitive youngest. The one who absorbed everyone's pain and tried to translate between different languages of need. Who learned early that her role was to smooth things over, make peace, disappear her own wants into the space between other people's conflicts. I said that sounded like her. Yes. Benya said Elena might forgive me eventually, but she wouldn't forget. That I needed to understand the difference between those two things. I wrote that down. Forgiveness versus forgetting. My pen made confident strokes across the page. Benya watched me write with an expression I couldn't read. I admitted I'd researched Elena online. Found her school's website where she taught 4th grade. Saw photos of her classroom with its reading corner and hand-drawn posters. Discovered through careful social media archaeology that she'd divorced 3 years ago. Had a dog named Pepper. Volunteered at the same women's shelter our mother had supported. I thought knowing these details showed I cared. That I'd done my homework. That I was taking this seriously. Benya's face did something subtle. A tightening around her eyes. She asked me what I planned to do with that information. I said I wanted to show Elena I knew her now. That I'd paid attention. Maybe mention the divorce sympathetically. Ask about her students. Demonstrate I understood her life. The quiet that followed felt like judgment. Benya said very carefully that my siblings were not a problem to be solved. Not a pitch to be optimized. Not a deal to be closed with the right combination of research and strategic vulnerability. I felt my jaw clench. I told her I was trying to do what she asked. Trying to connect. Trying to care. She said I was trying to control. There was a difference. My phone buzzed on the coffee table between us. Then again. Then a third time in rapid succession. The product launch was in 2 weeks and the engineering team had found a critical bug. I could see the notification previews lighting up the screen. Benya asked me to turn it off. I said I couldn't. There was too much happening. The launch was crucial. People were depending on me. She told me I was already failing. The words hit like a slap. I said that wasn't fair. I was here, wasn't I? I was doing the work. I was trying. Benya leaned forward. The afternoon light through her window caught the silver in her hair. She said if I went to my siblings performing care instead of feeling it, if I treated their pain as a strategic challenge instead of a wound I'd caused, I would destroy any chance of real reconciliation. I asked her what she wanted from me. She said she wanted me to go to our mother's house, not a neutral coffee shop or restaurant where I could control the environment. The house where our mother lived and died, where the grief lived in every room. My stomach dropped at the thought. I said that seemed unnecessarily painful. Wouldn't a neutral location be easier for everyone? Less emotionally loaded? Benya said the grief needed to be present in the room. Not avoided. Not managed. Present. My phone buzzed again. And again. The vibration seemed louder now, more insistent. I could feel my attention splitting, part of me already composing responses to messages I hadn't read. Benya asked if I was listening. I said yes, but my eyes had flickered to the phone. She'd seen it. She told me that until I could be fully present with my own discomfort, I had no hope of being present with anyone else's pain. That my constant escape into productivity and control was the same pattern that had destroyed my relationships in the first place. I wanted to argue, wanted to defend myself, wanted to explain that she didn't understand the pressure I was under, the responsibilities I carried, the complexity of my world. Instead, I reached for my phone and turned it off. The silence felt enormous. Benya nodded once. She said to call Elena, to ask to meet at the house, to arrive with nothing prepared. No talking points, no strategy, no armor. I asked how I was supposed to know what to say. She said I'd know when I stopped trying to control what happened and started actually listening. I left her apartment with my notebook still full of unused talking points. The Montblanc pen felt heavy in my pocket. On the street, I turned my phone back on and watched 17 notifications flood the screen. Each one felt like a small emergency, a crisis requiring my immediate attention. I called Elena instead. 2 days later, I stood outside our mother's house with the old key still on my keychain. I'd kept it all these years without knowing why. Never used it. Never came back except for obligatory holiday visits I'd cut as short as possible. Early evening light filtered through the trees, golden and thick. The kind of light that makes everything look like a memory. I put the key in the lock and my hand shook. The door opened onto lavender. The scent hit me like a physical force. Our mother had kept sachets everywhere. In drawers, closets, between couch cushions. The smell of my childhood, of comfort I'd spent decades running from. I almost left. Almost turned around and called Elena to suggest that coffee shop after all. Somewhere clean and neutral and safe. But I'd turned off my phone before I arrived. Following Benya's instruction. No escaperuts. The living room looked exactly the same. Floral couch our mother had owned since before I was born. Family photos on the mantel in mismatched frames. The dining table visible through the doorway, set for no one. Father's old armchair sat in the corner. He died when I was 12, David only 7. I remembered him as a quiet man who read the newspaper in that chair every evening. After he died, no one sat there. It became a kind of shrine. I walked over to it now, ran my fingers over the worn brown leather. Then I sat down. The chair held me differently than I expected. Solid. Grounding. I realized I'd never sat here before. In all my years in this house, I'd always perched on the edge of the couch, ready to leave. Never settled. Never belonged. The front door opened. Elena's footsteps in the hallway. She didn't call out a greeting. I heard her go straight to the kitchen. Water running. The kettle being filled. Cupboard doors opening and closing with familiar rhythm. She was making tea. I stayed in Father's chair and waited. Elena emerged carrying our mother's good tea set, the one with tiny painted flowers that came out only for special occasions, or when Mother needed comfort. She performed the ritual I'd never witnessed, warming the pot, measuring loose leaves, pouring water at the precise temperature. She did it all without looking at me. Finally, she sat on the floral couch and poured 2 cups, set one on the side table nearest me. The cup rattled slightly against the saucer. She asked why I was really here. I started to give her the answer I'd prepared. That I wanted to apologize. That I'd been wrong. That I hoped we could rebuild. She cut me off. Asked if Benya had told me to come. If this was another item on my productivity checklist. Reconcile with siblings, check the box, move on to the next optimization. The accuracy hurt. I said I wanted to make things right. Elena asked what our mother's favorite song was. The question landed like a trap. I searched my memory. Came up empty. I'd heard our mother sing countless times, humming while she cooked or cleaned. But I couldn't remember what. Elena said it was What a Wonderful World. The Louis Armstrong version. She played it constantly, especially near the end. I didn't know that. Elena's composure cracked. Her anger came through clean and sharp. She said of course I didn't know. I was never there. Not just at the end. For years. Every holiday I'd cut short for a conference call. Every achievement I'd mentioned that made their own accomplishments feel small. Every time I'd checked my phone instead of being present. I tried to say I was sorry. She talked over me. Told me about sitting with our mother for 3 weeks while she faded. How Mother asked for me every single day. Where's Marcus? When is he coming? I want to see Marcus before I go. Elena had lied. Told Mother I was on my way. That I'd be there soon. That I was just finishing important business. Mother died believing I was coming. The lavender smell felt suffocating now. I could see dust motes floating in the evening light. Thousands of tiny particles suspended in amber. I told Elena I didn't know how to be the person they needed. That I'd never known. The admission came out raw. Unplanned. Nothing like my prepared talking points. Elena didn't say it was okay. Didn't offer easy forgiveness. But she didn't throw me out either. She asked if I was actually ready to face David. I said I didn't know, but I wanted to try. She said David wouldn't come unless she asked him. That he was angrier than her. That he'd been Mother's baby, the one who'd lived closest, who'd visited weekly, who'd been there for every small thing I'd missed. I said I understood. Elena studied me in the fading light. Looked at me sitting in Father's chair. Something shifted in her expression. She said she'd asked David to come for dinner. 1 week from today. Here at the house. She'd cook Mother's beef stew. I thanked her. She said not to thank her yet. That David might refuse. Or might come ready to destroy me. That I needed to be prepared for his rage. I said I'd be here. Elena picked up the tea set and carried it back to the kitchen. I heard her washing the cups. The sound of water and porcelain. Domestic and ordinary and somehow devastating. I sat in Father's chair until full dark. The house settling around me. Springs creaking. Pipes ticking. The accumulated sounds of decades of life I'd abandoned. When I finally left, I locked the door carefully behind me. The lavender scent clung to my clothes all the way home. 1 week later, I arrived at the house at 6 o'clock. The autumn darkness had come early. The windows glowed warm against the cold. Elena had been cooking. I could smell the beef stew from the porch. Our mother's recipe. The one she made for birthdays and celebrations, and when one of us was sick or sad. David's car wasn't in the driveway yet. Elena let me in without speaking. gestured toward the dining room where she'd set the table for three. Mother's good dishes. Cloth napkins. A centerpiece of dried flowers. One chair sat visibly empty at the head of the table. Mother's place. I asked if I could help. Elena said I could sit down and wait. So I sat. Listened to her moving in the kitchen. The sounds of serving spoons against ceramic, the oven door opening and closing, her quiet humming. The same song. What a wonderful world. David arrived 20 minutes late. I heard his truck pull up, the door slam harder than necessary. His footsteps on the porch were heavy. He came in and looked at me for the first time in 8 months. His expression was pure contempt. Elena brought out the stew, placed the pot in the center of the table, began ladling it into bowls. The ritual of serving felt ceremonial. I tried small talk, asked David about work. He was a physical therapist, helped people recover from injuries and surgery. He gave one-word answers. Didn't ask me anything in return. Elena suggested we share favorite memories of Mother before we ate. An old family tradition I'd forgotten. David said his favorite was watching Mother die while asking for her oldest son, the one who loved money more than family, who couldn't be bothered to come home even when she was fading. The words were designed to wound. They succeeded. I felt my corporate mask crack. The careful composure I wore like armor. I told David the Singapore deal was failing. The company I'd chosen over our mother was struggling. The money I'd prioritized might all disappear anyway. David laughed. Bitter and sharp. He said at least I'd gotten something. All they got was grief and an empty chair at every future holiday. Elena tried to mediate. Asked us both to calm down. I couldn't calm down. Something was breaking open in me. I asked if they'd ever felt like they didn't quite belong. Like there was something different about them in the family. Like they were playing a role instead of just being. Both siblings looked confused. I admitted I'd always felt like an outsider. Like I had to earn my place through achievement, because I didn't naturally fit. Like being successful was the only way to justify taking up space in the family. The confession hung in the air. Elena spoke quietly. Said she'd felt that way too. As the middle child nobody noticed. Always mediating, always invisible, never quite mattering enough. David admitted he'd felt it as the youngest. Always trying to catch up to his older siblings. Always too young, too inexperienced, too late to the conversation. The realization settled over us. That we'd all felt like outsiders in different ways. That the family we'd idealized in our separate griefs had been more complicated than any of us remembered. Elena started telling stories about Mother's patience. How she'd sat with me for hours while I struggled with math homework. How she'd taught Elena to bake even though Elena kept burning everything. How she'd gone to every single one of David's basketball games and cheered louder than anyone else. David added memories I'd never heard. Mother's terrible singing voice that never stopped her from performing. Her superstition about hats on beds. Her way of knowing when any of us were lying before we even opened our mouths. I remembered Mother's habit of leaving notes in our lunch bags. How she'd write encouragement on napkins, terrible jokes, sometimes just I love you in her careful handwriting. We were laughing. Actually laughing. The sound felt foreign and precious. Elena did an impression of Mother trying to use a smartphone. How she'd hold it at arm's length and poke at it with one finger. How she'd called it the devil's rectangle. David nearly choked on his stew laughing. My phone buzzed in my pocket. The vibration felt obscene against the moment's fragility. I pulled it out and silenced it without looking at the screen. Set it face down on the table. David noticed. Gave a slight nod. The first acknowledgement I'd seen in his eyes. We ate in silence for a while. The stew tasted exactly like I remembered. Comfort and home and everything I'd run from. Rain started outside. Gentle at first, then harder. The sound on the roof created a cocoon around us. Elena asked if I remembered Mother's rain ritual. How she'd make hot chocolate, and we'd all sit in the living room watching the storm. Ide furguten. But David remembered. Said he still did it sometimes. Made hot chocolate when it rained and thought about her. The empty chair at the head of the table felt different now. Not accusing. Just present. Part of us. David asked if I was really staying this time. Not just for dinner, but actually staying. Being present. Being family. I said I wanted to. He said wanting wasn't the same as doing. I agreed. Said I'd have to prove it. That I understood words weren't enough. David studied me. Rain drummed against the windows. The house creaked and settled around us. He said we'd see. It wasn't forgiveness. But it wasn't rejection either. It was a door left open. An invitation to try. We stayed at the table until late. Talking about small things and large ones. The gaps in the conversation felt less painful now. More like natural pauses than hostile silences. When I finally left, Elena hugged me at the door. Brief and careful. But real. David shook my hand. His grip was firm. Not friendly exactly. But not hostile either. I drove home through the rain feeling something I couldn't quite name. Lighter. More connected. Like I'd found a thread back to something essential I'd lost. 2 weeks later I sat in Benya's apartment feeling almost buoyant. The autumn light was fading early now. Shadows gathering in the corners of her cluttered room. I'd brought her expensive tea. A rare oolong from a specialty shop. The kind that costs more than most people spent on groceries. She accepted it with a small smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. I told her about the dinner. About the subsequent coffee meetings with Elena, where we talked about her students and her dog. About going to a basketball game with David where we'd sat in companionable silence eating overpriced nachos. David had sent me a meme yesterday. Just a stupid joke about coffee. But I'd stared at it for 5 minutes. The casual intimacy of it. The assumption that we shared humor now. Benya asked what I'd learned about myself. I talked about my siblings instead. How Elena was stronger than I'd realized. How David had their mother's laugh. How we were building something new. Benya noted I was deflecting from her actual question. I said I felt lighter. More connected. Like I was finally getting it right. She observed that I seemed happier. But my watch was new and expensive. I'd checked it 3 times since arriving. I'd asked to reschedule our next meeting for a board call. I said the business still needed attention. That didn't mean I wasn't committed to my family. Benya asked if I'd told my siblings the company was struggling. The question caught me off guard. I admitted I hadn't. Said I wanted to wait until things stabilized. Didn't want them to think I was only coming back because of failure. Benya's expression shifted subtly. She'd caught something in my answer. She said the real test was coming. That my siblings needed to make a decision about Mother's house. I felt my attention sharpen. The house was worth substantial money. The neighborhood had gentrified. Property values had tripled since Mother bought it decades ago. Benya said Elena and David wanted to donate it to the women's shelter our mother had supported for 40 years. The shelter needed space to expand. Mother had always said she'd leave them something in her will, but she'd died before updating it. My mind was already calculating. The house was worth at least $800,000. Split 3 ways. That was significant capital. Money I could use to shore up the business. Or invest. Or secure. Benya watched my face. I knew she could see the calculations happening. She asked what I thought Mother would want. I said I'd need to think about it, that it was a big decision, that we should consider all the options carefully. The words sounded reasonable, measured, responsible, but Benya's eyes held something like disappointment. She said some choices reveal who we've truly become, that this was one of those choices. I told her I understood, that I'd talked to Elena and David, that we'd figure it out together. My phone vibrated in my pocket. Once, twice, 3 times. I ignored it, kept my eyes on Benya. She could still hear it though. The faint buzzing against fabric. My constant companion. My escape hatch. She said our time was up for today, that she'd see me next week. I stood to leave, picked up my coat. The expensive tea still sat on her table in its elegant wrapper. At the door I turned back, asked if she thought I'd changed. Benya was quiet for a long moment. Then she said I'd learned to perform connection. That wasn't the same as transformation, but it was a start. I wanted to argue, wanted her to acknowledge how hard I'd worked, how much progress I'd made. Instead, I thanked her and left. On the street, I checked my phone. 15 messages. The board was panicking about quarterly projections. The product launch had been delayed again. Investors were asking questions. I started responding immediately, fingers flying across the screen, solving problems, managing crises, doing what I was good at. Elena had texted too, asked if I was free Sunday, said they needed to discuss the house. I stared at her message for a long time. The house, worth $800,000, maybe more with the right buyer. Split 3 ways, $266,000 each. Money that could save my company, money that represented security, worth, or a donation to a shelter, honoring Mother's values, her legacy of generosity, helping women who needed space and safety and a second chance. I knew what Benya would say, what my siblings probably expected, what the right choice was supposed to be. But standing on the street with the autumn wind cutting through my coat, I felt that old familiar pull, the calculation, the optimization, the voice that said I'd worked hard for everything I had, that I deserved security, that giving away that much money was foolish when my own foundation was crumbling. I typed a response to Elena, said Sunday worked, that I'd be there. I didn't say what I was thinking, didn't admit that my first instinct had been to calculate the money, to see the house as an asset to be leveraged rather than a legacy to be honored. I told myself I was still considering all the options, being responsible, thinking it through. But I could feel the old patterns reasserting themselves. The gravitational pull of worth measured in dollars, of security found in accumulation, of value proven through possession. The question sat in my chest like a stone, heavy and uncomfortable and impossible to ignore. What would I choose? The money or the meaning? The security or the legacy? The person I'd been or the person I wanted to become? My siblings were waiting for an answer. Benya was waiting to see if her faith in my potential for change was justified. My mother's memory was waiting to see if I'd learned anything at all. And I stood on a darkening street, phone in hand, feeling the weight of a choice that would reveal everything about who I truly was beneath the performance of transformation. The afternoon light turned everything in my mother's house to amber. I arrived 40 minutes early, telling myself I wanted time to think through the logistics of dividing her belongings. That was partially true. The house still smelled like her. Lavender sachets tucked into drawers she'd never emptied. And walking through these rooms felt like moving through water. I touched the banister she'd gripped when the cancer made stairs difficult. The wood was smooth under my palm, worn by decades of her hand. In the kitchen, her cookbook sat on the counter where she'd left it, pages marked with ingredient stains and her careful annotations. I picked it up, felt its weight, set it down again. Through the window, I could see the neighborhood had changed. The corner store where she bought groceries for 40 years was now an artisanal coffee shop. The houses on either side had been renovated, their values probably tripled. This property, in this location at this moment in the market cycle, I couldn't help calculating what it represented. The doorbell interrupted my assessment. I checked my watch, confused they were early, then saw through the window that Elena and David had brought someone with them. An older woman in a colorful wrap, carrying a folder. My stomach tightened with the sudden understanding that this meeting had been choreographed without me. Elena made the introductions in the living room where we'd eaten dinner as children. Mrs. Okoye directed the women's shelter where my mother had volunteered. She'd brought photos, I realized, as she opened her folder with gentle ceremony. My mother's face smiled up at me from image after image, serving meals, organizing donations, sitting with women whose faces were carefully angled away from the camera. Mrs. Okoye's voice carried the musicality of her Nigerian childhood. She told stories about my mother I'd never heard. How she'd come every Tuesday for 30 years, never missed a week even during chemotherapy. How she'd given her own wedding ring to a woman who needed bus fare to escape an abusive husband. How she'd told Mrs. Okoye that the shelter needed a permanent home, that the women deserved stability. I felt something shift in the room's atmosphere. Elena was watching me with careful intensity. David sat very still, his hands folded in his lap. This wasn't a discussion about dividing belongings. This was something else entirely. Elena's voice was soft but certain when she explained the plan. The house should go to the shelter, become a permanent residence where women could stay while rebuilding their lives. It was the obvious choice, she said. The only choice that honored who our mother had been. Her eyes never left my face. My mind was already calculating the property value, the market conditions, the opportunity cost. But I heard myself asking for time to think about it, suggesting we discuss it as a family first, meaning without Mrs. Okoye present. The words came out more sharply than I'd intended. The warmth we'd built over the past 2 weeks cracked like ice under sudden weight. I could see Elena's shoulders tense. David's quiet statement cut through my careful neutrality. Their mother would have wanted this. She always gave everything away. This was who she was. The emphasis on there made my exclusion clear. I promised to consider it seriously. I needed to leave before my face showed what I was really thinking. Mrs. Okoye thanked me for my openness, which made the guilt worse. Elena and David exchanged a glance as I walked to the door, the kind of wordless communication siblings develop over decades. I'd never learned their language. In my car, I sat gripping the steering wheel. The house was worth $1.2 million, probably more given the gentrification. I could donate money to the shelter. I could honor my mother's generosity without surrendering control of a major asset. The distinction felt important, though I couldn't articulate why. The evening pressed against Benya's windows when I arrived at 9 without calling ahead. She opened the door in her reading glasses, marking her place in a book with one finger. I could see from her face that she knew why I'd come. I paced her small apartment while I laid out the situation. The house was worth substantial money. I could sell it, donate the proceeds, maybe even more than the property's value if I leveraged it correctly. The shelter would get cash they could use however they needed. It was the practical solution, the smart solution. I heard myself using phrases from board meetings: return on investment, asset optimization. Benya let the silence stretch after I finished. She sat in her worn armchair, the one where I'd sat weeks ago trying to convince her to help me reconcile with my siblings. The tick of her old clock marked seconds. My untouched tea grew cold on the side table. She asked what my mother would have wanted. I deflected to practicality. Cash versus property made no financial difference to the shelter. Actually, cash was more flexible, more useful. I was trying to be smart about honoring her, I explained. Trying to maximize the impact of the gift. Benya told me a story then. She'd spoken with Mrs. Okoye after the meeting today. They'd called her, I realized. She knew I'd come. Mrs. Okoye had shared something my mother had told her years ago. That real generosity meant giving the thing itself, not its equivalent value. That surrender, not calculation, was the point. My mother had given her wedding ring, Benya said. Not sold it and donated the money. Given the actual ring, the object that held meaning, without controlling what happened to it next. She'd never told her children because the act itself was enough. I argued that was different, possibly even irrational. I was trying to honor my mother intelligently, I said. Trying to be responsible about this. The words sounded hollow even as I spoke them, but I pushed forward. I needed to control the narrative of redemption, I realized. Needed to be the one who decided how my mother's legacy was transformed. Benya's statement was direct. This was the test. Whether I could let go of something valuable without controlling how it was used. Whether love mattered more than worth. Whether I'd actually changed or just performed change well enough to earn forgiveness. I felt defensiveness rise in my chest like heat. She didn't understand business realities. Selling the house and donating the money was more responsible, more rational. I could ensure the funds were used correctly, invested properly, maximized for long-term impact. My voice was rising slightly. I pulled it back down. Benya's observation was quiet. I was choosing the path that let me keep power. Generosity without surrender wasn't generosity at all. It was another transaction. Another deal where I maintained control of the terms. I left agitated, but not quite angry yet. She was being idealistic, I told myself. She didn't understand how money actually worked, how to make resources go further. I was trying to do the right thing, just in a smarter way. The distinction felt crucial. My penthouse office glowed with screen light at 2 a.m. I had multiple browser tabs open. Comparable house sales in the neighborhood. All of them higher than I'd estimated. The shelter's donation page, showing their modest annual budget. Investment calculators demonstrating what the house's value could generate if properly managed. The real estate agent I called the next morning was enthusiastic. The market was at peak, she said. Properties in that neighborhood were moving fast. If I wanted to maximize value, I should list soon. I heard the opportunity in her voice, the commission she was calculating. But also the truth. This was the moment to sell. Waiting would mean losing money. I drafted an email to Elena and David explaining my decision. The first version was too defensive. The second too cold. The third tried to be warm but read as condescending. The fourth just laid out the facts. I could sell for $1.3 million, donate the full amount to the shelter. They'd have more money this way than if we donated the property itself. It made sense. It was logical. It was the right choice. A memory surfaced unbidden. My mother's voice from childhood. Something about giving without counting the cost. I physically shook my head to clear it. That was sentiment, not strategy. I was trying to help more effectively. The moment I hit send on the listing agreement with the realtor, relief flooded through me. Decision made. Path chosen. Then the hollow sensation followed, like biting into fruit and finding it empty. I sat very still, waiting for the feeling to pass. I texted my siblings with my decision, framed it as a practical compromise that honored our mother's generosity, while maximizing impact. I kept the tone warm, reasonable. I checked my phone every few minutes, waiting for their response. Understanding would come, I told myself. They'd see the logic eventually. Elena's response arrived 6 hours later. Just one line about disappointment. David didn't respond at all. I typed and deleted 3 different replies. Finally sent nothing. They'd come around. Time would show them I'd made the right choice. 3 days compressed into a blur of spreadsheets and calculations. I researched investment strategies for the proceeds, called financial advisors about setting up a structured donation that I could oversee, made sure the shelter would get the money in a way that I could monitor, that I could ensure was used correctly. The silence from my siblings grew heavier each day. I told myself it was temporary, that once the sale completed and they saw the donation amount, they'd understand. That logic would eventually overcome emotion. At night, I stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows looking at the city lights. The hum of my expensive computer filled the silence. My glass desk was cold under my palms. The blue light from screens was the only illumination. No cooking smells. No life sounds. Just the sterile quiet of expensive isolation. I touched my phone screen, checking for messages that didn't come. The reconciliation was crumbling in the silence, but I couldn't admit that yet. I'd made the right choice. I had to have made the right choice. Elena finally agreed to meet me 4 days after my decision. 30 minutes during her lunch break at a coffee shop near her work. The fluorescent lights made everyone look slightly ill. The espresso machine hissed constantly. I arrived early with talking points on my phone. Bullet points I'd refined and reorganized. She arrived exactly on time looking tired. Not angry, which confused me. Resigned. She ordered coffee and sat across from me, stirring in sugar with slow, deliberate movements. I began my explanation. Market timing, donation efficiency, the mathematics of maximizing impact. I had charts on my phone showing how much more the shelter would receive through my approach. Elena didn't interrupt. She just watched me over the rim of her coffee cup, her expression unreadable. I misread her quietness as openness. Continued with my spreadsheet logic, the calculations that proved I was honoring our mother more effectively than an emotional property donation would. My voice gained confidence. She was listening. She would understand. Her question cut through my presentation like a blade. Had I even considered what our mother wanted? Or just what made sense to me? I felt my defensiveness activate. I was trying to honor her practically, I said. Sentiment didn't help anyone. I was being realistic, responsible. Someone had to think about actual impact rather than symbolic gestures. Elena's next statement was delivered in a tone I'd never heard from her before. Quiet, certain, devastating. I'd come back not to change, but to be forgiven without changing. Reconciliation was another deal I'd tried to negotiate. Another transaction where I controlled the terms. She said she'd hoped I was different. That for a few weeks she'd had her brother back. But I was still choosing money over them, over everything that actually mattered. The past tense in her voice made my chest tight. Elena stood before her coffee was finished. Told me not to come to David's daughter's birthday party next month. The invitation was withdrawn. She walked out without looking back, leaving her cup still steaming on the table. I sat alone with 2 coffee cups. Other customers' conversations washed over me. The fluorescent lights hummed. My scone had crumbled under my nervous fingers, reduced to crumbs I brushed off my expensive pants. I'd lost them again. The thought arrived with strange detachment. But I couldn't admit I was wrong. The numbers were right. The logic was sound. They were being emotional. time would prove my decision correct. By 8 that evening, I'd had enough whiskey to blur the edges of Elena's words. I showed up at Benya's apartment without calling, needing someone to tell me I was right, that my siblings were being unreasonable, that I'd made the smart choice. Benya opened the door and I saw her register my state immediately. The slight alcohol smell, my wrinkled shirt, the manic energy of someone trying to outrun realization. She stepped aside to let me in. I didn't sit properly. I launched into an account of Elena's unfairness, my reasonable position, their overreaction to a logical business decision. I needed her to admit I was being practical, that donating money was equivalent to donating the house, that my siblings were letting emotion override sense. Benya's silence stretched long before she spoke. The weight of her disappointment filled the room, even though she didn't express it directly. Rain started against the windows, a soft percussion that made the silence heavier. She said I'd come seeking peace but wasn't willing to pay its price. Reconciliation required me to become different, not just seem different. I'd performed change well enough to earn forgiveness, but when actual transformation was required, I'd chosen safety. Anger finally surfaced, hot and righteous. She didn't understand. Easy for her to judge. I was trying to do the right thing my way. Why did it have to be their way? Why couldn't logic and love coexist? Benya's observation was quiet. Some choices could not be undone. I was breaking something that wouldn't be repaired. She could not absolve what I wouldn't release. The house would sell. My siblings would leave. And I would spend years trying to prove I'd been right, but the proof wouldn't bring peace. Her final statement landed like a weight. I would proceed with the sale. I would have my justifications and my money. And I would tell myself that time would prove everyone else wrong. But I would never stop checking my watch, never stop calculating worth, never stop feeling like I didn't belong. I left angry, telling myself she was wrong, that she was being as emotional as my siblings. That time would show everyone my decision was sound. But her words followed me into the night, into the rain that soaked through my expensive coat. I stood on the sidewalk outside her building. Rain ran down my face. I pulled out my phone with shaking hands. The email to the realtor was already drafted. All I had to do was hit send. Confirm the sale should proceed as planned. My thumb hovered over the screen. The house would be sold. The siblings were gone. I had my justifications and my money and the hollow certainty that time would prove me correct. I had everything I'd wanted when I started this process. Everything except the thing I'd actually needed. I hit send. The phone chimed confirmation. The decision was made. The path was chosen. I was right. I had to be right. The rain fell harder. I stood there holding my phone, watching the screen blur with water. Somewhere across the city, my mother's house sat empty, filled with her belongings and lavender scent. Soon it would belong to someone else. Soon the shelter would have money I could monitor and control. Soon I would prove that logic and love were the same thing. Soon I would believe my own justifications. Soon the hollow feeling would fade. Soon everything would make sense. I told myself these things as I walked to my car. I repeated them as I drove through rain-slick streets. I whispered them in the elevator to my penthouse. I clung to them as I stood at my floor-to-ceiling windows, looking at city lights that offered no answers. The phone in my hand was silent. No messages from Elena. No calls from David. No text from Benya saying she understood after all. Just the blue glow of the screen and the reflection of my face in the glass. A man who'd chosen worth over love and called it wisdom. I'd made the right choice. I had to have made the right choice. The alternative was unbearable. The law office occupied the 42nd floor of a glass tower in the financial district. I arrived 20 minutes early, as I always did for important meetings. The reception area gleamed with polished marble and chrome, everything sharp-edged and impersonal. Exactly the kind of space where I felt most comfortable. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the city below, reduced to geometry and distance. My lawyer, Richard Chun, greeted me with the efficient warmth of someone billing $400 an hour. He led me to a conference room that smelled of new leather and expensive coffee. The kind of coffee that came from a machine worth more than most people's cars. The marble table stretched between us, cold and smooth under my palms. Richard spread documents across the surface with practiced precision. 3 weeks had passed since my argument with Benya. 3 weeks of silence from my siblings. 3 weeks of telling myself I'd made the right choice, the only practical choice. He reviewed each document without looking up. He referred to my mother's house only as the property, the asset, the holding. My mother herself never appeared in his language. She had been reduced to a line item, a deceased owner, a former title holder. I found this comforting in a way I couldn't quite articulate. The numbers aligned perfectly. The sale price exceeded the appraisal by 6%. After estate taxes and fees, my portion would transfer immediately to my investment account. Richard explained the tax implications in the same tone he might use to discuss weather patterns. I signed the first set of documents. The pen was heavy, German-made, probably cost more than the entire contents of my mother's bedroom. The scratch of gold nib on premium paper filled the silence. Everything proceeding exactly as it should. The conference room door opened. Richard's assistant showed in the buyers, a young couple in their early 30s. The husband wore a sport coat that didn't quite fit, probably bought for this occasion. The wife carried a toddler on her hip, a little girl with dark curls and sticky fingers. They were nervous. The husband's handshake was too firm, overcompensating. The wife kept adjusting the toddler, using the child as something to do with her hands. They sat across from me with the gravity of people for whom this transaction represented years of saving, of sacrifice, of hope. Richard introduced everyone with corporate efficiency. The couple's names were Jason and Maya Torres. The toddler was Sophia, 18 months old. Maya bounced her gently, and the child watched me with the unnerving directness of the very young. We began signing. Richard walked everyone through each document, explaining terms that didn't need explanation. The Torreses listened with absolute attention, treating this moment as sacred. This was, I realized, probably the biggest financial decision of their lives. For me, it was a Tuesday morning. Jason made small talk as we signed. Nervous energy seeking release. He mentioned their plans for the house with the enthusiasm of someone describing a dream finally within reach. They were going to knock down the wall between the kitchen and dining room, create an open floor plan. More light, more space for Sophia to play. Maya added details. They'd paint over the wallpaper in the master bedroom, replace the fixtures in the bathroom. The lavender bedroom upstairs would become a nursery. They'd already picked out colors, soft yellows and greens, something gender-neutral in case they had another child. My pen hovered above the next signature line. The lavender bedroom. My mother's favorite color. The room where she'd sewn curtains by hand, where she'd kept her books and her reading chair. They were going to paint over it. Erase it. Make it something else entirely. I completed the signature. The scratch of the pen seemed louder than before. Richard continued through the documents. Title transfer, deed recording, disclosure acknowledgments. Each page another layer of separation. The house was becoming theirs, stopping being hers, stopping being anything to do with my family at all. Jason mentioned the garden. They were planning to plant vegetables in the spring. Maybe build a swing set in the backyard where the old oak tree stood. The tree where my mother had hung bird feeders every winter, where she'd sat in the shade during summer evenings. I signed another page. And another. The stack of completed documents grew. Maya asked if I'd grown up in the house. The question felt intrusive, too personal for this transaction. I said yes, briefly, keeping my voice neutral. She smiled and said it must be nice to know a family would be living there again, that the house would have children's laughter in it. I managed something that might have been agreement. Richard caught my eye, reading the discomfort, and smoothly redirected the conversation back to the documents. The final signatures took less than a minute. Richard witnessed, his assistant notarized, and it was done. The house belonged to the Torreses. The money belonged to me. Everything neat and legal and irrevocable. We stood. Handshakes all around. Jason's grip was still too firm, but now it carried genuine gratitude. Maya thanked me, said they'd take good care of the house. Little Sophia reached for me with sticky hands, and I stepped back reflexively. They left discussing paint colors. Their voices faded down the hallway, swallowed by the building's expensive silence. Through the window, I watched the city spread out below, indifferent and vast. Richard asked if I wanted to review the wire transfer instructions. I did. We spent another 10 minutes confirming account numbers and routing information. He assured me the funds would appear in my account by end of business day. Everything was proceeding perfectly. I told him to transfer my portion of the proceeds immediately. No delay, no holding account. I wanted this completed, finished, behind me. He made notes with the same expensive pen I'd used to sign away my mother's house. Walking to the elevator, I waited for relief to arrive. For satisfaction. For the sense of having made a smart financial decision. The doors opened with a quiet chime. I stepped inside. The feeling never came. Only a spreading numbness, cold and complete, like frostbite setting in. My penthouse apartment occupied the top floor of a building in the Pearl District. Floor-to-ceiling windows on 3 sides. Panoramic views of the city and mountains beyond. I'd bought it 5 years ago as a statement of arrival. Proof that I'd made it. That I belonged in this world of steel and glass and distance. I sat at my desk in the home office. Late afternoon sun slanted through the western windows. My laptop displayed my investment account dashboard. I'd been refreshing it every few minutes for the past hour. The notification appeared at 4:47 p.m. Wire transfer received. The number was substantial. 6 figures. More money than my mother had earned in the last decade of her life. More money than most people saw in a year. It sat in my account, glowing on the screen, waiting for me to feel something about it. I stared at the number. Waited for vindication. For the satisfaction of having made the practical choice. For relief that the house was no longer my responsibility, no longer a weight around my neck. For anything. The number didn't change. Neither did I. I poured scotch into a crystal tumbler. Single malt, aged 25 years, $200 a bottle. It tasted like smoke and peat and expensive indifference. I carried it to the living room window and watched the city prepare for evening. Lights were beginning to activate in windows across the skyline. Thousands of people in thousands of rooms. Families gathering for dinner. Couples settling in for the night. Children doing homework at kitchen tables. All of it happening without me, separate from me, on the other side of the glass. I remembered standing at my mother's kitchen window as a child. The view had been just neighborhood backyards and telephone wires. Nothing impressive, nothing worth photographing. But I'd stood there with her while she washed dishes, and she'd pointed out birds at the feeder. Cardinals and jays and chickadees. She'd known all their names. That window had felt warmer somehow, less like a barrier. I checked my phone. No messages. No missed calls. I opened the text thread with Elena. Her last message from 2 weeks ago stared back at me. Short and final. You'll never change, Marcus. I hope the money makes you happy. My thumb hovered over the keyboard. I should respond. Say something. Explain myself. Apologize. Something. But every phrase I considered sounded hollow in my head before I could type it. I closed the thread. Checked email instead. Work messages, market updates, automated alerts from various accounts. Nothing personal. Nothing human. The scotch was half gone. I didn't remember drinking it. I poured more. My laptop sat on the dining table. I had a presentation due for Monday's board meeting. Quarterly projections and strategic initiatives. The kind of work that usually absorbed me completely. I opened the file and stared at slides full of graphs and data points. The numbers meant nothing. The strategies felt hollow. I'd spent 15 years building a career on this kind of analysis, on making everything quantifiable and rational. Now the spreadsheets looked like symbols in a language I'd forgotten how to speak. I worked anyway, because the alternative was sitting with the silence. Because if I wasn't working, I didn't know what I was for. The hours bled together. The city outside went fully dark. My reflection appeared in the windows, ghostly and transparent against the lights below. I looked thin. When had I gotten thin? I couldn't remember my last real meal. Near midnight, I realized I'd been refreshing my email every few minutes, checking my phone for messages that weren't coming, looking for something I couldn't name, some signal that I wasn't as alone as I felt, some indication that selling the house had been right, had been worth it, had accomplished something other than converting my mother's memory into numbers on a screen. The empty chair at my dining table caught my eye. Set for one. Always set for one. The scotch glass sat next to my laptop, leaving a ring on the expensive wood. I should use a coaster. I should clean up. I should do a lot of things. I left the glass there and went to bed. The sheets were cold. The bedroom was silent except for the climate control system's mechanical hum. I lay in the darkness and counted the days since the funeral. 14 weeks. 98 days. 2,352 hours. All of them exactly like this. I sent the email to Elena on a Thursday morning in mid-January. Carefully worded, not too emotional, suggesting coffee sometime when she was free. Casual but sincere. I revised it 6 times before hitting send. Her response came 3 days later. Brief and polite. Thanks for reaching out, but I'm pretty busy right now. Maybe another time. The tone was cordial. The message was clear. She was done. I read it twice looking for openings. Found none. She'd signed it simply with her name. Not love, not even best. Just Elena. I tried David next. Called him on a Tuesday evening when I knew he'd be home from work. The first call went to voicemail. His voice on the recording sounded tired but warm, asking me to leave a message. I didn't. The second call 3 days later he answered. His hello was cautious. We exchanged pleasantries that felt like negotiations. How are you fine? How are you fine? The conversation moved in careful circles. I asked about his kids. He gave short answers. They're good, busy with school. I asked about work. Same thing, keeping busy. Every response a polite wall. He mentioned, almost in passing, that he and Elena had been volunteering at their mother's charity, the community center where she worked for 20 years. They were helping organize a scholarship fund in her name. His voice warmed slightly when he talked about it. I offered to donate money, a substantial amount, whatever they needed. I could write a check today. David was quiet for a long moment. Then he said softly, "That's not really what Mom would have wanted. She'd have wanted time, not money. Presents, not checks." His tone wasn't angry, just sad. Final. The call ended shortly after. He said he had to go, dinner was ready. I heard children's voices in the background before he hung up. Life happening on his end of the line. Life I wasn't part of. I drove to the old neighborhood on a Saturday in late January. No plan, no reason. Just found myself heading that direction. Muscle memory of a route I'd driven 1,000 times. I parked across the street from my mother's house. What used to be my mother's house? What was now the Torres's house? A contractor's truck sat in the driveway. The front door stood open. I could see into the living room. The wallpaper was half stripped. The old carpet was gone, replaced with bare subflooring. Furniture I didn't recognize sat covered in drop cloths. A man in work clothes carried lumber through the front door. The sounds of construction echoed from inside. Maya Torres appeared in the doorway, holding little Sophia. She was pointing at something, explaining plans to someone I couldn't see. She looked happy, excited, building her future in the space where my past had happened. I sat in my car for 20 minutes, waiting to feel something, some connection to the place, some sense of loss or nostalgia or regret. Some ghost of the child who'd lived there, who'd done homework at that kitchen table, who'd learned to ride a bike on that driveway. Nothing came. It was already someone else's home, already being transformed into something my mother would never recognize. The connection, whatever it had been, was severed completely. I drove away before anyone noticed me, before I had to explain what I was doing there, watching their house like a stranger. Elena's daughter turned 7 in early February. I found out from social media. A photo of the birthday girl, gap-toothed and grinning, holding a homemade cake. Elena's caption mentioned a small family party that weekend. I ordered a gift, something expensive and tasteful from a high-end toy store. Educational, age-appropriate, exactly the kind of thing wealthy uncles sent when they didn't actually know the child. I had it wrapped and shipped directly to Elena's address. Her text came 2 days later. "Thanks for the gift. That was thoughtful." Nothing more. No invitation to the party. No suggestion we get together soon. Just acknowledgement of receipt, like confirming a business transaction. The photos from the party appeared on social media that Sunday. Elena's daughter surrounded by family. Elena and her husband, David and his wife and kids, cousins and grandparents from the other side. Everyone laughing, celebrating together. David was in several photos, playing with the kids, cutting cake. His arm around Elena's shoulders. The siblings united. The family intact. An empty space where I might have been if I'd made different choices. If I were a different person. I scrolled through the photos 3 times, counting faces, identifying relatives, noting details. The party was at Elena's house. The decorations were homemade. The cake was slightly lopsided, clearly baked by amateur hands. Everything warm and imperfect and real. Everything I wasn't part of. I closed the app, poured more scotch. It was becoming a pattern. The bottle in my freezer was empty more often than full. February bled into early March. I worked. I drank. I slept poorly. I checked my phone compulsively. I sent no more emails or texts to my siblings. The silence between us solidified into something permanent. They created a life that didn't include me. Not out of cruelty, just out of natural drift. I'd made my choice at the funeral. They'd made theirs in the weeks after. We were on different paths now, paths that didn't intersect. The reconciliation I'd briefly had, those few days around the funeral when we'd been united in grief, now felt like a memory from someone else's life. The current silence was worse than the years of distance before. Now I knew what I was missing. Now the absence had names and faces in specific moments. I was more alone than I'd been in years. More alone than before I'd tried. The money from the house sale sat in my investment account. Growing, compounding, doing exactly what money was supposed to do. The number got bigger. Nothing else changed. I stopped counting the days since the funeral. Started counting drinks instead. Started arriving at the office later. Started leaving earlier. Started avoiding mirrors because the person looking back was becoming someone I didn't recognize. My assistant asked if I was feeling all right. I said I was fine. She didn't look convinced. No one did. But no one pushed. That was the advantage of being senior management. People gave you space. Even when space was the last thing you needed. I showed up at Benya's apartment on a Tuesday in early March. Late afternoon when the light was soft and forgiving. I hadn't called ahead. Hadn't planned it. Just found myself driving there instead of back to my empty penthouse. She opened the door and looked at me for a long moment. No surprise in her face. Just recognition. As if she'd been expecting this. Expecting me to eventually end up here. Deteriorating and desperate and unwilling to admit either. "Come in," she said. Her voice was gentle. She stepped back and I entered. Her apartment smelled like bergamot tea and old books. The radiator clanked and hissed. Everything worn and comfortable and real. So different from my sterile penthouse. So much warmer. I sat at her kitchen table without invitation. The chair creaked under my weight. I'd lost more weight. My expensive clothes hung differently now, tailored for a body I no longer had. Benya made tea. I watched her move through the familiar ritual. Kettle on the stove. Cups from the cabinet. Loose leaves measured carefully. She didn't ask why I was there. Didn't demand explanation. Just made tea and waited. She set a cup in front of me. I didn't drink it. Couldn't remember the last time I'd consumed anything that wasn't coffee or alcohol. The steam rose between us. I talked about work. Markets. A merger we were considering. Quarterly projections. Anything except what mattered. The words felt hollow even as I spoke them. Corporate language. Safe language. Language that kept everything at a distance. Benya listened with infinite patience. The kind of patience that comes from knowing the truth will eventually surface. That you can't rush it. That sometimes people need to exhaust their defenses before they can be honest. She asked about my siblings. Simple question. Direct. I dismissed it with more corporate language. We needed space. Different priorities. Everyone's busy. The phrases came automatically. Practice deflections. She asked about the house. How did the sale go? Was everything settled? I became defensive without meaning to. It was the right decision. The buyers are happy. The money is invested wisely. Everything worked out perfectly. My voice rose slightly. Insisting. Trying to convince her. Trying to convince myself. Benya was quiet for a moment. Then she asked very gently if I'd ever gone through my mother's belongings carefully. Really looked at what she'd left behind. The question caught me off guard. I admitted with some irritation that I'd hired an estate service. Professional organizers. They'd handled everything. Sorted, donated, disposed of. Very efficient. Everything taken care of. She went very still. Something shifted in her expression. Not judgment. Something deeper. Sadness, maybe. or recognition of an opportunity lost. I asked why it mattered. What difference did it make who packed up her things? It all ended up in the same place. Donated or discarded. Just stuff. Just objects. Benya set down her teacup carefully. Sometimes, she said, the things we need most don't announce themselves. They wait to be found. They hide in quiet places. And if we're not looking, if we're not present, we miss them entirely. I dismissed this as sentiment. Pretty words that didn't change practical reality. My mother was gone. Her house was sold. Her belongings were dispersed. Nothing was going to change those facts. No hidden object or forgotten letter was going to alter the fundamental truth of loss. The words sounded hollow even as I said them. Benya heard it too. I could see it in her face. She didn't argue. Didn't try to convince me. Just looked at me with those eyes that saw too much. That saw the tremor in my hands. The smell of alcohol that was becoming part of me. The way I couldn't stop checking my phone. The hollow quality behind my eyes. I stayed longer than I intended. Talking about nothing important. Work gossip. Market trends. Anything to avoid the silence of my apartment. Anything to delay returning to that empty penthouse where no one waited and no one called. The light outside shifted from afternoon to evening. Benya's kitchen grew dimmer. She didn't turn on the overhead light. The softer light was kinder. Hid more. Finally, I stood to leave. Made excuses about early meetings. She walked me to the door. Didn't ask me to stay. Didn't ask me to come back. Just watched me with that same sad recognition. I'm worried about you, she said as I reached the doorway. I'm fine, I said automatically. The lie was so practiced it required no thought. She didn't contradict me. Just held my gaze until I looked away. Until I stepped into the hallway. Until the door closed quietly behind me. Walking to my car, I felt worse than when I'd arrived. The brief comfort of her apartment made the return to isolation sharper. Made the contrast more painful. I'd sought connection and found it. Now I had to leave it behind and go back to being alone. The drive home felt longer than it should have. The city lights blurred past. My phone sat silent on the passenger seat. No messages. No missed calls. No one wondering where I was or when I'd be home. I thought about Benya's question. About my mother's belongings. About things that wait to be found. But the thought was uncomfortable. Easier to dismiss it. Easier to focus on the road. On the practical matter of getting home. On anything except the possibility that I'd missed something important. That I'd thrown away more than I understood. 2 weeks passed. I didn't return to Benya's apartment. Didn't call. The visit had been too revealing. Too close to acknowledging things I wasn't ready to face. Work consumed me. Or I let it consume me. The distinction was unclear. I stayed late at the office. Took calls at midnight. Volunteered for projects no one else wanted. Filled every hour with tasks and obligations and problems I could solve. Because the problems at work had solutions. The problems in my life didn't. I was in my office on a Wednesday evening in mid-March. 6 p.m. Most of the floor had emptied. Just me and a few other executives who'd also forgotten how to go home. A late meeting was running over. Market analysis for the European division. Numbers and projections and strategic initiatives. My phone buzzed. Benya's name on the screen. I almost ignored it. Almost let it go to voicemail. But something in the timing felt wrong. She never called in the evening. Never interrupted without reason. I excused myself from the meeting. Stepped into the hallway. Answered. Her voice was strange. Tight. Urgent. Marcus, you need to come to my apartment. Right now. I was immediately irritated. I'm in a meeting. Whatever it is can wait. My tone was dismissive. Automatic defensiveness against anything that threatened my control. No, she said. Her voice cut through my irritation with unusual sharpness. It can't wait. You need to come now. Tonight. Immediately. I heard something I'd never heard in her voice before. Not anger. Not disappointment. Urgency mixed with grief. Something that made my stomach tighten. What is it? I asked. What's wrong? She wouldn't say. Just repeated that I needed to come. That this couldn't be discussed over the phone. That it was important. That it couldn't wait. I'm busy, I said. But the protest was weaker. Something in her tone was cutting through my usual defenses, making it impossible to dismiss her. Marcus, she said. Very quietly. Very seriously. I have never asked you to do anything. I am asking you now. Come to my apartment. Right now. This cannot wait until tomorrow. This cannot wait another hour. The silence on the line was heavy. I could hear her breathing. Could hear the weight of whatever she wasn't saying. I'll be there in 30 minutes, I said. I hung up. Stood in the hallway for a moment. Experiencing a dread I couldn't name. A certainty that whatever waited at her apartment was going to change something fundamental. I returned to the conference room. Told my team to continue without me. Something urgent had come up. They exchanged glances but didn't question. I grabbed my coat and briefcase. Moved toward the elevator. In the parking garage, my footsteps echoed off concrete. My car started with its expensive purr. I pulled into traffic. The city moved around me. Commuters heading home. Couples going to dinner. Normal people living normal lives. My phone buzzed with work messages. I ignored them. Focused on driving. On getting to Benya's apartment. On finding out what had put that tone in her voice. The dread grew with each mile. Nameless. Formless. Just a certainty that I was driving towards something irrevocable. That whatever she'd found, whatever she needed to tell me, was going to shatter the careful walls I'd built. The city lights blurred past. The radio played something I didn't hear. My hands gripped the steering wheel too tightly. My breath came shallow. I didn't know yet that a damaged envelope waited. That my mother's handwriting would soon appear before me. That the young couple renovating the house had found something hidden. Something meant for me. Something I'd almost destroyed through my own efficiency. I just knew that Benya's voice had carried urgency and grief in equal measure. That she'd never sounded like that before. That I was driving toward a revelation I wasn't ready for. That everything was about to shatter. And I couldn't stop it. Couldn't turn around. Could only drive forward into whatever truth waited in that apartment. The city stretched out before me. Indifferent. Fust. Beautiful and cold. I drove through it. Toward Benya. Toward the envelope. Toward the moment when I would finally understand the magnitude of what I'd lost. Toward the letter that could have changed everything. If only I'd been willing to look for it. 6 months had passed since the house sale. Spring had arrived with its usual indifference to human suffering. I sat in my penthouse watching rain streak the windows, calculating quarterly projections that no longer meant anything. When Benya called asking me to come to her apartment that evening, I almost declined. I had a conference call scheduled with Tokyo, but something in her voice made me cancel it instead. I arrived at her small apartment irritated anyway, checking my watch as she opened the door. I had emails piling up. Markets were volatile. My time was valuable. But Benya's face stopped my excuses mid-sentence. She looked at me with an expression I'd never seen before. Something between pity and resignation. "You've gotten thinner," she said, stepping aside to let me in. "And there's a tremor in your hands now." I pulled my hands into my pockets, defensive. I told her I was fine, just busy. Just asked her what this was about so I could get back to work. She led me to her small living room. The worn armchair faced a coffee table where tea sat steeping. And beside the teacups, a water-stained envelope lay like an accusation. The new homeowners called me, Benya said quietly. They knew I'd counseled your mother and the family. They found something during renovation and thought it should reach you. I felt my jaw tighten. I asked why she was involving herself in my business affairs. Whatever sentimental object my mother had hoarded wasn't my concern anymore. I'd moved on. Benya didn't respond. She simply placed her hand near the envelope, drawing my attention to it fully. The handwriting visible through the water damage made my breath catch. My name, in my mother's careful script. I started to reach for it, then pulled back. My hands were shaking worse now. I asked how badly damaged it was, whether anything inside was even readable, hating how my voice cracked on the question. Benya sat down slowly. She told me the new owners had found it sealed in the wall behind the kitchen, where my mother had apparently hidden it intentionally. The water damage from their renovation had made parts illegible, but enough remained. I stood frozen, staring at the envelope. Outside, rain began falling harder, drumming against the windows. The musty smell of damaged paper reached me even from across the table. What does it say? I asked. Benya shook her head gently. That's for you to discover. But Marcus, you need to sit down first. I didn't want to sit. I wanted to leave, to return to my empty penthouse where numbers made sense and nothing could hurt me. But my legs moved without permission, carrying me to the armchair. The envelope sat between us, heavier than it should be, final as a gravestone. My hand shook so badly I could barely break the seal. Benya offered to read it aloud, but I refused sharply. I needed to see my mother's handwriting myself. Needed to know her words were real. The first line made the room tilt. My dearest Marcus, my chosen son. I stopped. Reread the words. Looked up at Benya in confusion. She nodded once, confirming what I was seeing, what couldn't possibly be true. I returned to the letter with desperate focus. My mother's handwriting flowed across the page, careful and deliberate. She explained that I was adopted, that she had chosen me specifically when I was 3 days old, that she had wanted me with a fierceness that surprised even her. You were never an outsider except in your own mind, she wrote. You were always my son, always belonged, always loved. The words blurred. I blinked hard, forcing them back into focus. She explained how she'd watched me grow, how she'd seen me pull away from the family, how she'd understood I felt different, how she'd ached to tell me the truth, to explain that I was chosen, that belonging isn't about blood but about commitment. Then the water damage began. An entire section, maybe 4 or 5 lines, rendered completely illegible. Blurred ink and pulped paper where words used to be. I held the letter closer to the lamp, tilting it, desperate to catch any fragment. But the damage was absolute. Whatever she'd written about why she waited, about my birth family, about the context I needed, was gone forever. My chest constricted. I set the letter down, picked it up again, tried different angles in the light. Nothing. Just the ghost of ink where truth used to live. The next legible section made my throat close. She asked me to forgive her for not telling me sooner. Said she'd loved me with the kind of love that only comes from choice, not obligation. That she'd wanted to wait until I was ready to understand. More water damage. Another gap. Then the final lines, intact and devastating. I'm leaving you this letter to find after I'm gone, she wrote. When you're settling my affairs with the care and love I know you're capable of. When you're ready to understand that you were never a burden, never an obligation. You were my greatest choice, Marcus. My beloved son. The letter ended there. No signature visible through the damage. Just her words, fractured and incomplete, telling me everything and nothing. I set it down on the table. The paper crinkled slightly under my fingers, damaged and fragile. Rain hammered the windows like it was trying to break through. I picked the letter up again, holding it to the light, trying desperately to decipher the water-damaged sections. But the context was gone. The explanation was gone. The full truth was gone. And I had destroyed the place where she'd hidden it. I started calculating aloud before I realized I was speaking. I could buy the house back, I said, pacing between Benya's living room and her small kitchen. Pay whatever they wanted. Demand they search for more letters, more hidden messages. Benya's voice came quiet from behind me. They already looked, Marcus. The contractors searched thoroughly when they found this one. There was nothing else. I spun toward her, desperate. Then my mother's belongings, the things the service cleared out. Maybe there were other letters. Maybe. You hired a service, Benya said gently. You never went through anything yourself. You were too busy. The words hit like a physical blow. I had been too busy, too efficient, too focused on liquidating assets and moving on. My mother should have told me earlier, I said, hearing the rationalization even as I spoke it. The siblings must have known. Someone should have stopped the sale. Benya remained silent. Her silence was worse than any argument. I felt my legs give out. I collapsed into her armchair, the letter clutched in both hands, and the full weight crashed down on me like a building falling. Elena and David were my true family, I said aloud, the realization forming as I spoke. Not by blood but by choice. By years of shared experience and commitment. And I destroyed our reconciliation for money I didn't even need. The house, I continued, my voice breaking. The house held my mother's final gift. Her explanation for why I always felt different. Her unconditional love. And I sold it. Demolished it for profit. The confession poured out then, unstoppable. I told Benya what I'd never admitted to anyone. That I'd always felt like I didn't belong because I was different. Quieter than David. More serious than Elena. Not quite fitting the family dynamic. And she'd known, I whispered. She'd had an answer. Had unconditional love waiting for me in those walls. And I destroyed it. The weeping started somewhere deep in my chest, a sound I didn't recognize as my own. I held the fragments of my mother's words, understanding that the damaged sections might have contained crucial information about my birth, my history, my identity, all lost to my greed. I looked up at Benya through tears, desperate. What do I do? How do I fix this? Her face was kind but unyielding. There's nothing to do, Marcus. Some choices cannot be undone. Some losses cannot be recovered. The storm outside seemed to mirror something breaking inside me. I gripped the letter too tightly, heard the paper crinkle in protest. But I couldn't let go. The absence of lavender scent hit me suddenly, viscerally. The house was gone. The kitchen where my mother had hidden this letter. The walls that had held her secret. The foundation where I might have built something real with my siblings. All demolished. All sold. I sat in Benya's worn armchair and understood completely what I'd traded away. Dawn crept through the windows eventually. I hadn't left. Couldn't seem to make my body move. The letter lay on the table between us now. Benya had made tea hours ago. Neither of us had touched it. A film had formed on the surface. Why did she hide it in the wall, I asked. My voice sounded hollow. Why not leave it somewhere obvious? Benya considered this. I think she wanted you to find it when you were truly ready. Perhaps during the process of settling her affairs with love rather than efficiency. I closed my eyes. I'd never gone through her belongings myself. Hired a service to clear everything. Too busy to spend time in the house, touching her things, remembering. There might have been other letters, I said slowly. Photos. Explanations. Benya's silence confirmed what I already knew. Do you think she knew I would sell the house? I asked. Benya's answer came carefully. I think she hoped you wouldn't. Hoped you changed. But she knew her son well enough to hide the letter where only care and attention would find it. The pale morning light made the water damage on the letter more visible. The gaps where words used to be seemed larger now, more final. Should I tell Elena and David? I asked. Benya turned the question back on me. What do you hope to accomplish? Are you seeking their comfort or trying to make them share your pain? I had no answer. The truth was I didn't know what I wanted anymore. Benya spoke then, her voice taking on the quality of someone bearing witness to a truth she'd seen too many times. We destroy what we most need when we cannot believe we deserve it. Money can buy everything except the things that matter. Some foundations once broken cannot be rebuilt. I looked at her directly. Do you think I deserve this? Her expression didn't change. It's not about deserving, Marcus. It's about the consequences of choosing fear over trust, control over surrender, wealth over love. The words settled over me like a final judgment. Not cruel, just true. I sat in the silence after the storm. It wasn't peaceful, just empty. The absence of lavender scent seemed to fill the room, a ghost of what I'd destroyed. Outside, the city was waking up. People starting their days, unaware that someone's entire understanding of themselves had shattered in the night. I understood now. Completely. Finally. Too late. I stood at Benya's door as morning brightened the sky. The damaged letter was in my hand. I asked if I could keep it. It was always meant for you, she said. Just not like this. One final question forced itself out. Do you think my mother would have forgiven me? Benya's answer was immediate. Your mother already had forgiven you, Marcus. The letter proves it. But forgiveness doesn't erase consequences. I nodded. There was nothing else to say. I left without checking my phone, without the hurried energy that usually defined my movements. I walked like someone much older, carrying weight that would never lighten. From her window, Benya watched me cross the street to my car. The envelope was visible in my hand. My expensive suit was rumpled from the long night. She'd counseled people for decades, watched so many destroy their own chances at peace. But something about Marcus's loss felt particularly complete, particularly irreversible. He would carry this forever. The knowledge that his mother's unconditional love had been waiting in the walls he sold. That his siblings had offered reconciliation he'd rejected. That the answer to his lifelong feeling of not belonging had been hidden in the house he demolished for profit. Love was never conditional, Benya thought. Only his trust in it was. The smell of lavender lingers in memory though the house is gone. Some foundations once broken cannot be rebuilt. She watched Marcus's car pull away. He sat inside holding fragments of his mother's words, understanding too late what he'd traded away. Benya turned from the window back to her apartment. The cold tea sat on the table. The empty chair where Marcus had collapsed still held the impression of his weight. The space where someone had come seeking absolution and left with only truth. She picked up the teacups and carried them to her small kitchen. Outside, the city continued its indifferent rhythm. Inside, the absence of lavender remained absolute. Marcus would wake each morning for the rest of his life knowing what he'd destroyed. Would hold those water-damaged fragments and try to imagine what the missing words contained. Would calculate endlessly what he might have learned if he'd chosen differently. But some losses must simply be carried. Some damage is permanent. Some choices once made define us forever. The morning light grew brighter. Benya washed the teacups carefully, methodically. And in the distance, Marcus drove toward a future that would never contain what he needed most. The letter's fragments rested on his passenger seat. His mother's careful handwriting visible through the damage. The words "my chosen son" still legible. The gaps where context used to be remained dark and absolute. He would carry those fragments for the rest of his life, would hold them and weep, would understand completely that he'd traded his healing for money he didn't need. And nothing in the world could ever bring it back.